Welcome, kind listener, to this peaceful haven of history. This is a place where stories flow like a gentle river, carrying us far away from the rush of the present. Whether you are lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, or sitting quietly as the evening settles, know that you are among friends here. If you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from. I treasure the chance to see how history brings together people from every corner of the world. And if these calm journeys speak to you, go ahead and subscribe, so our paths may cross again in the chapters to come. But for now, let the noise of today drift away, and join me as we wander softly into the mists of the past. Tonight, we travel to a place that once seemed eternal, a civilization that believed itself destined to endure until the very stars grew cold. We journey to Rome, that great city built upon 7 hills beside a winding river, where the dreams of mortals reached toward the heavens and touched something that felt, for 1,000 years, almost like forever. This is the story of rise and fall, of ambition and glory, of human beings who built something extraordinary and watched it slowly crumble, leaving behind ruins that still whisper to us across the centuries. Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine the Mediterranean world long before Rome was anything more than a cluster of shepherds' huts. Picture the lands surrounding that ancient sea, where countless peoples made their homes, each with their own gods and stories, their own ways of making sense of the mystery of existence. The Greeks had already raised their temples and pondered the nature of truth. The Phoenicians had sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, trading purple dye and precious goods. The Egyptians, ancient even then, still stood beside their monuments to eternity. And in the heart of the Italian peninsula, on the banks of the Tiber River, something new was beginning to stir. The legends say that Rome was founded in 753 before the Common Era, born from an act of violence between brothers. Romulus and Remus, the twin sons of the war god Mars, abandoned as infants and nursed by a she-wolf beneath a fig tree, grew to manhood with a destiny written in their very blood. But destiny, as the Romans would learn again and again, is a complicated thing. The brothers quarreled over where to build their city, each reading the flight of birds for divine favor, each certain that the gods had chosen them. In the end, Romulus killed Remus and traced the boundaries of Rome with a plow, declaring that anyone who crossed his sacred boundary would meet the same fate as his brother. It was a beginning steeped in blood, a foundation built on fratricide, and perhaps that tells us something about the empire that would grow from those humble origins. But let us not linger too long in myth, though myth has its own truths to tell. The reality of early Rome was far less dramatic than the legends suggest, though no less fascinating for those who look closely. Archaeological evidence reveals a settlement that grew gradually over centuries, a collection of Latin and Sabine villages on those famous hills, slowly coalescing into something more unified, more purposeful. These early Romans were farmers and shepherds, practical people who valued hard work and piety, who honored their household gods and the spirits of their ancestors. They were not yet conquerors, not yet builders of empire. They were simply people trying to make a life in a world full of dangers. The landscape they inhabited was both generous and challenging. The Tiber River provided water and a route for trade, but it also flooded unpredictably, turning the valleys between the hills into malarial swamps. The hills themselves offered defensible positions, crucial in a time when neighboring tribes might raid at any moment. To the north lay the Etruscans, a sophisticated civilization with their own writing system and impressive cities, who would profoundly influence Roman culture. To the south, Greek colonies dotted the coastline, bringing with them the philosophy and art of Hellas. Rome sat at a crossroads, absorbing influences from all sides, synthesizing them into something uniquely its own. In those earliest days, Rome was ruled by kings, a succession of 7 monarchs according to tradition, though the line between history and legend blurs in this distant era. These kings were not hereditary rulers but chosen leaders, elected by the people and confirmed by the Senate, that council of elders whose name would echo through the centuries. Some of these kings were wise and just, like Numa Pompilius, who established Rome's religious institutions and brought a period of peace after Romulus's warlike reign. Others, like Servius Tullius, reformed the army and divided the people into classes based on wealth rather than birth, laying foundations for Rome's future military success. But the last king, Tarquin the Proud, became a tyrant, arrogant and cruel, until finally the Roman people could bear no more. The catalyst, as legend tells it, was an act of terrible violence against a virtuous woman named Lucretia, whose death sparked a revolution. In 509 before the Common Era, the Romans expelled their king and swore a sacred oath: never again would they submit to monarchy. They would govern themselves, creating a republic, a form of government whose name derives from residential publica, the public thing, the commonwealth. It was an idea that would shape not just Rome's future, but the political imagination of civilizations yet unborn. The early republic was an experiment, a new way of organizing power and responsibility. Two consuls, elected for one-year terms, would share executive authority, each able to veto the other, ensuring that no single individual could seize absolute power. The Senate, composed of former magistrates and prominent citizens, advised the consuls and shaped policy. Various assemblies allowed the people to vote on laws and elect officials. It was a system full of checks and balances, designed by people who had learned to fear concentrated power, who believed that liberty was worth protecting at almost any cost. But liberty, as the Romans discovered, is a complicated thing. The early republic was dominated by the patricians, the aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to Rome's founding, who held most of the wealth and all of the important priesthoods. The plebeians, the common people who formed the bulk of Rome's population and its army, found themselves excluded from power, their voices unheard, their grievances ignored. This tension between classes would drive much of Rome's internal history, a constant struggle between those who had and those who wanted, between tradition and change, between the few and the many. The plebeians fought back not with violence but with a remarkable invention: the strike. When the patricians pushed too hard, demanded too much, the plebeians simply left the city, withdrawing to the sacred mount outside Rome and refusing to fight in its armies or work in its fields. Without the plebeians, Rome could not function, and the patricians had to negotiate. Gradually, step by step over 2 centuries, the plebeians won concessions. They gained their own officials, the tribunes, who could veto any action that threatened plebeian interests. They won the right to marry patricians, to hold high office, to have laws written down rather than kept secret by aristocratic priests. The 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code, was posted in the forum where everyone could see it, a declaration that law belonged to everyone, not just the powerful. This ability to adapt, to reform without revolution, to expand the circle of participation rather than defending privilege to the death, became one of Rome's great strengths. It was never a democracy in the Athenian sense, this Roman Republic. The voting system favored the wealthy, and the Senate remained dominated by a small number of prominent families. But it was flexible enough to channel discontent into reform, to give enough people enough stake in the system that they would defend it. And defend it they did, for 500 years, through crisis after crisis, building in the process an empire that encompassed the known world. But let us not rush ahead. Let us linger for a moment in those early centuries when Rome was just one Italian city among many, unremarkable to foreign eyes, struggling to survive in a dangerous neighborhood. War was constant in those days, not the grand campaigns of conquest that we associate with imperial Rome, but smaller, grinding conflicts with neighboring tribes. The Volsci, the Equi, the Sabines, all pressed against Roman territory. The Etruscans to the north represented a constant threat. Every spring, when the campaigning season began, Roman farmers would leave their fields to fight, hoping to return before harvest. It was a hard life, precarious, shaped by violence and the ever-present possibility of defeat. And Rome did face defeat, came close to destruction more than once in those early years. In 390 before the Common Era, a Celtic war band swept down from the north, shattering a Roman army at the Allia River and sacking the city itself. The Romans who survived fled to the Capitoline Hill, defending that last stronghold while Gauls looted and burned below. According to legend, it was sacred geese, kept for the goddess Juno, whose honking alerted the defenders to a night attack, saving Rome from complete destruction. The Gauls eventually left after receiving a ransom, but the trauma of that sack never left the Roman consciousness. They rebuilt their city with strong walls, walls that would stand for 8 centuries. They drilled their armies harder, reformed their tactics, and swore that such humiliation would never happen again. From that low point, Rome began its long ascent. The key to Roman success was their legion, a military formation that evolved into perhaps the most effective fighting force of the ancient world. Unlike the Greek phalanx, which fought as a dense mass of spears, the legion was flexible, divided into smaller units called maniples that could adapt to different terrain and tactics. Roman soldiers were not professionals in these early days but citizen farmers, men who had something to fight for, who owned property and wanted to protect it. They were drilled endlessly, taught to fight in formation, to obey orders instantly, to trust the men beside them. They learned to build fortified camps every night, even when deep in enemy territory, creating a temporary fortress where they could rest securely. They learned to march incredible distances, carrying their own equipment, earning the nickname Marius's mules, after a later general who increased what each soldier was expected to carry. But Roman expansion was not just about military might. The Romans had a genius for organization, for taking conquered peoples and binding them to Rome not just through force but through self-interest. They offered different levels of citizenship and alliance, creating a hierarchy of relationships. Some conquered cities became full Roman citizens, their people indistinguishable from Romans born in the capital. Others became allies, maintaining their own governments but required to supply troops for Rome's armies. Still others were colonies, settlements of Roman citizens planted in strategic locations, serving as garrisons and spreading Roman culture. This system allowed Rome to mobilize vast military resources, far beyond what the city itself could provide. More importantly, it gave conquered peoples a stake in Roman success. If Rome won, they shared in the spoils. If Rome was threatened, they fought to defend it because their own interests were now intertwined with Rome's. Slowly, methodically, sometimes suffering terrible setbacks but always recovering, Rome conquered the Italian peninsula. It took 200 years of almost constant warfare, but by 270 before the Common Era, all of Italy south of the Po River acknowledged Roman supremacy. Rome was no longer just another Italian city. It was the capital of a confederation that could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, that controlled resources and manpower on a scale no single city could match. And then Rome collided with Carthage, and the Mediterranean world would never be the same. Carthage was a great power, a merchant city on the North African coast, heir to the Phoenician trading network that stretched from the Levant to the Atlantic Ocean. The Carthaginians were wealthy beyond Roman imagination, their ships carrying precious goods to every port, their generals commanding armies of mercenaries purchased with Carthaginian gold. Where Rome relied on citizen soldiers fighting for honor and property, Carthage hired professionals, men who fought for pay. Where Rome was a land power, Carthage ruled the waves, its navy dominating the western Mediterranean. These two powers, so different in culture and character, were bound to clash. The First Punic War began in 264 before the Common Era, sparked by a dispute over Sicily, and lasted 23 grinding years. Rome, with no naval tradition, had to learn to fight at sea, building a fleet from scratch by copying a captured Carthaginian vessel. They invented new tactics, the corvus, a boarding bridge that allowed Roman soldiers to turn naval battles into infantry fights. They lost entire fleets to storms but built new ones. They suffered defeats that would have broken lesser peoples but kept fighting. The war devastated both sides, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, bankrupted treasuries. But in the end, Rome won. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, and Carthage, though still powerful, had been humbled. But Carthage was not finished. In Iberia, in what is now Spain, a Carthaginian general named Hamilcar Barca was building a new base of power, mining silver, recruiting warriors, preparing for the day when Carthage would take revenge on Rome. He died before he could fulfill his dream, but he passed his hatred of Rome to his son, a boy named Hannibal, who swore at his father's altar that he would be Rome's eternal enemy. Hannibal Barca became one of history's greatest generals, a military genius whose campaigns are still studied today. In 218 before the Common Era, he launched the Second Punic War with one of the most audacious moves in military history. Rather than fight Rome at sea where their advantage was uncertain, Hannibal led his army overland, from Spain, through Gaul, across the Alps in winter with elephants and tens of thousands of men. He lost half his army in that crossing, but he emerged in northern Italy, and for 16 years he ravaged the Roman homeland, winning victory after victory, slaughtering Roman armies with innovative tactics that used the Romans' own strength against them. At Cannae, in 216 before the Common Era, Hannibal fought the perfect battle. A Roman army of 80,000 men, the largest Rome had ever fielded, faced Hannibal's smaller force. The Romans advanced in their traditional formation, confident in their numbers. Hannibal deliberately weakened his center, which bent back under Roman pressure while his cavalry drove off the Roman horsemen and his flanks held firm. Then, when the Romans were fully committed, pressing forward in a dense mass, Hannibal's cavalry returned and closed the trap. The Roman army was surrounded, packed so tightly that they couldn't use their weapons effectively. For 9 hours, Hannibal's men slaughtered them. 50,000 Romans died that day, including senators and nobles, the worst military disaster in Roman history. Rome should have fallen then. Any other city, any other nation would have sued for peace after such a catastrophe. Hannibal expected embassies, negotiations, surrender. But the Romans did something that shocked him, something that revealed the iron in the Roman soul. They refused to negotiate. The Senate decreed that there would be no peace while Hannibal remained in Italy. They forbade even speaking of surrender. They recruited new armies from boys too young and men too old, from slaves promised freedom if they fought. They assessed every citizen's wealth and demanded contributions to continue the war. And they sent a general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, whose father and uncle had died fighting Hannibal in Spain, to carry the war to Africa itself. Scipio was young, brilliant, unorthodox, a man who had studied Hannibal's tactics and learned from them. He conquered Carthaginian Spain, then crossed to Africa and threatened Carthage itself, forcing the Carthaginians to recall Hannibal from Italy where he had spent 16 years undefeated. In 202 before the Common Era, at Zama, Scipio and Hannibal finally faced each other. Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him, outmaneuvered the great general, and won a decisive victory. The Second Punic War was over. Carthage was broken, forced to pay a crippling indemnity, forbidden to wage war without Roman permission. Rome was now the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. But victory came at a terrible price. Italy had been devastated by 16 years of war. Farms were ruined, villages destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Romans and Italians had died. The old virtues of the early republic, the simple farmer soldiers who fought for home and hearth, were giving way to something harder, more militaristic. Rome had learned that it could survive anything, endure any disaster, but in learning that lesson, something in the Roman character had changed. And Rome kept fighting, kept expanding, because that's what Rome did now. In the east, the wealthy kingdoms that had emerged from Alexander the Great's empire presented tempting targets. Macedon, which had sided with Hannibal during the Dark Days, had to be punished. The Seleucid Empire in Syria was growing too powerful, needed to be humbled. Rome's eastern wars were different from the grinding campaigns in Italy and against Carthage. These were wars against kingdoms rich beyond imagining, whose rulers lived in palaces surrounded by unimaginable luxury, whose cities were filled with libraries and temples and works of art. Roman soldiers who had never owned anything finer than their weapons suddenly found themselves looting treasures that seemed to belong to the realm of myth. The wealth that poured into Rome from these conquests transformed the city and the Republic. Greek culture, which the Romans had long admired from a distance, now flooded in. Greek slaves, many of them educated men who had lost their freedom through the chances of war, became tutors to Roman children, secretaries to Roman magistrates. Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek literature captivated the Roman imagination. Some Romans, traditionalists who remembered or idealized the simple virtues of old Rome, resisted this Hellenization, warned that Greek sophistication was corrupting Roman character. Cato the Elder famously ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of topic, with the phrase, "Furthermore, I think Carthage must be destroyed," but he was equally hostile to Greek influence, which he saw as weakening Roman moral fiber. But the tide of Greek culture could not be stopped, and in the end, Rome did not remain purely Roman but became a synthesis, Greco-Roman, taking the best of Greek civilization and combining it with Roman strength and organizational genius. The Romans would write poetry that rivaled Homer, philosophy that engaged with Plato and Aristotle, while maintaining the military discipline and political acumen that had built their empire. They became, in their own eyes and in some real sense, the inheritors and preservers of Greek civilization, the people destined to bring order and culture to a chaotic world. Yet as Rome conquered outward, it was coming apart within. The Republic's political system, designed for a city-state, was straining under the weight of empire. Magistrates who governed provinces with absolute power for years grew accustomed to authority that no consul in Rome could wield. Generals who commanded armies for long campaigns developed personal loyalties with their troops, bonds that could supersede loyalty to the Republic itself. And the economic basis of Roman society was shifting in dangerous ways. The small farmers who had formed the backbone of Rome's citizen army were disappearing. Military service meant years away from home, and many farmers returned from distant wars to find their farms ruined, unable to compete with the vast estates of the wealthy, which were worked by the countless slaves that flowed into Italy from Rome's conquests. These displaced farmers drifted to Rome, swelling the urban population, forming a volatile mass that had little stake in the existing system and could be mobilized by demagogues offering bread and spectacle. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, saw this crisis and tried to address it. Tribunes of the plebs in the 130s and 20s before the Common Era, the Gracchi brothers proposed land reform, redistributing public land to poor citizens, challenging the senatorial aristocracy that had monopolized these lands. It was a noble effort to restore the old Roman virtue of the citizen farmer, but it threatened too many powerful interests. Both brothers were killed by mobs led by senators defending their privileges. The Republic's ability to reform itself peacefully, which had been one of its great strengths, was breaking down. Political disputes were increasingly resolved not through debate and compromise but through violence. The late Republic became a time of civil wars, as ambitious men realized that traditional paths to glory were too slow and restrictive. Why wait for the cursus honorum, the sequence of offices that a respectable Roman had to hold, when you could raise an army and seize power directly? Marius, a brilliant general from an undistinguished family, reformed the army, opening it to landless citizens and promising them land from conquests, binding soldiers' loyalty to their general rather than to the state. He fought a terrible war against Germanic tribes threatening Italy from the north and saved Rome, but he also set a precedent that would destroy the Republic. Sulla, an aristocrat who had served under Marius but quarreled with him, became the first Roman general to march on Rome itself with his legions, violating the sacred boundary of the Pomerium, that ancient line traced by Romulus, the line no armed soldier was supposed to cross. Sulla seized control, was appointed dictator, and used his power to proscribe his enemies, posting lists of men to be killed, their property confiscated. Thousands died. Then, having reshaped the republic to his liking, Sulla did something unexpected. He resigned and retired to private life. It was as if he wanted to prove that the old ways could be restored, that the republic could function as it once had. But the lesson ambitious men learned from Sulla was not about restraint but about possibility. If Sulla could seize power, why not others? Into this turbulent world came three men whose actions would determine the republic's fate: Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Pompey was Rome's most successful general, who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, conquered the East, and returned with wealth and glory beyond measure. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, who had made his fortune in property and slavery and craved military glory to match his wealth. And Caesar was a brilliant, ambitious aristocrat from an old but not particularly wealthy family, a man of enormous charm and talent and utterly ruthless determination. These three formed an alliance, informal at first, each using the others to achieve what the Senate tried to deny them. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and recognition of his eastern settlement. Crassus wanted tax reforms that benefited his business interests. Caesar wanted a major military command where he could win the glory that would place him on par with Pompey. They called it a private agreement, but history knows it as the First Triumvirate, and it marked the Republic's death sentence, though few realized it at the time. Caesar got Gaul, the vast territories beyond the Alps that were only partially under Roman control. For 9 years, from 58 to 50 before the Common Era, Caesar campaigned in Gaul, fighting numerous Celtic tribes, crossing the Rhine to raid Germanic territories, even mounting expeditions to Britain. He was a military genius, capable of incredible marches and daring tactics, and he was also a brilliant writer whose commentaries on the Gallic Wars served as both a historical record and propaganda enhancing his reputation. By the end of those 9 years, Caesar had conquered all of Gaul, a territory larger than Italy itself, added immense wealth to Rome, and commanded a loyal, battle-hardened army devoted to him personally. But in Rome, the triumvirate was fracturing. Crassus had sought military glory in the east, leading an army against Parthia, Rome's great rival beyond the Euphrates. It was a disaster. At Carrhae in 53 before the Common Era, Crassus's army was destroyed by Parthian horse archers, and Crassus himself was killed. The balance of the triumvirate was broken. Pompey, alarmed by Caesar's growing power and popularity, reconciled with the Senate, which saw him as the lesser threat. They demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand for consul. Caesar knew that if he obeyed, his enemies would prosecute him on trumped-up charges, destroying him politically and perhaps physically. On the banks of a small river called the Rubicon, which marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy, Caesar made his choice. With just one legion, he crossed, uttering the famous words, Alia iacta est, the die is cast. It was January of 49 before the Common Era, and civil war had begun. Pompey and the Senate fled to Greece to raise armies. Caesar moved with his characteristic speed, securing Italy, then Spain, then crossing to Greece to face Pompey directly. At Pharsalus in 48 before the Common Era, Caesar's veterans defeated Pompey's larger army. Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge, but the Egyptians, trying to curry favor with the winner, murdered him and presented his head to Caesar. Caesar, according to the sources, wept at the death of his former friend and son-in-law, though tears came easily to Roman politicians when they served a purpose. In Egypt, Caesar met Cleopatra, the young queen embroiled in a civil war with her brother. He intervened on her behalf, beginning a relationship that was both political and personal, that produced a son, and that would eventually entangle his heir in the final act of the Republic's drama. But that was still in the future. Caesar had more enemies to defeat, more campaigns to fight. He chased Pompey's sons and supporters across the Mediterranean world, winning battle after battle, sometimes against difficult odds, always demonstrating the military brilliance that made him perhaps Rome's greatest general. By 45 before the Common Era, Caesar was master of the Roman world. He was appointed dictator, initially for a limited term but eventually for life, and he set about reforming Rome. He was not needlessly cruel to defeated enemies, indeed, his clemency became famous. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that, with minor modifications, we still use today. He planned vast construction projects, the resettlement of veterans, and legal reforms. Some see in these actions the moves of a monarch preparing to rule an empire. Others see a reformer trying to fix a broken system. Perhaps he was both. But Caesar moved too fast, accumulated too much power, offended too many people who clung to republican ideals or simply resented being overshadowed. On the Ides of March, the 15th day of March, in 44 before the Common Era, a group of senators calling themselves the Liberators surrounded Caesar as he entered the Senate and stabbed him 23 times. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, and his blood stained the marble floor. The Republic, the conspirators believed, was saved. They were profoundly mistaken. Caesar's assassination plunged Rome into another round of civil wars, more vicious than before. Caesar's ally Mark Antony and his 19-year-old adopted son Octavian eventually hunted down the assassins and defeated them at Philippi. Then Antony and Octavian divided the Roman world between them, Antony taking the wealthy east, Octavian the war-torn west. For a decade, an uneasy peace held. Antony, in the east, fell under the spell of Cleopatra, the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, a woman of intelligence and ambition who saw in Antony a means to restore her kingdom's glory. Octavian, in Rome, carefully built his power base, presenting himself as a restorer of traditional values, a defender of Rome against Eastern decadence. War was inevitable. At Actium, off the coast of Greece, in 31 before the Common Era, Octavian's fleet defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled to Egypt, where they committed suicide as Octavian's armies closed in. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, died from the bite of an asp, choosing death over being displayed in Octavian's triumph. Egypt became a Roman province, and Octavian stood alone, unchallenged master of the entire Roman world. But Octavian was clever in ways Caesar had not been. He understood that Romans would not accept open monarchy, that republican sentiment still ran deep, that he needed to maintain the forms and language of the republic even as he created something new. In 27 before the Common Era, Octavian appeared before the Senate and offered to restore the republic, to resign his extraordinary powers. It was political theater, of course. The Senate, filled with his supporters, begged him to continue, to save Rome from chaos. They granted him a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one, a title with religious overtones. They voted him powers that made him effectively emperor while maintaining the fiction that he was merely the first citizen, the princeps, serving the republic. The settlement of Augustus marked the end of the republic and the beginning of the empire, though no one at the time would have phrased it quite that way. Augustus was careful to maintain republican institutions. The Senate still met. Consuls were still elected. Laws were still passed. But real power rested with Augustus. He controlled the armies, governed the key provinces, could veto anything, and his patronage network reached into every corner of Roman society. He ruled for 41 years, from 27 before the Common Era until his death in 14 of the Common Era, and in those 4 decades he transformed Rome. Augustus brought peace after a century of civil wars, and the Romans were grateful. The Temple of Janus, which stood open in times of war and closed in peace, was shut for the first time in 2 centuries. This Pax Romana, this Roman peace, would last for 200 years, an unprecedented period of stability and prosperity in the ancient world. Trade flourished from Britain to India. Cities grew and beautified themselves. Roads connected the empire, allowing information, armies, and commerce to flow efficiently. Roman law spread, creating a common framework for resolving disputes. Latin became the language of administration in the West, Greek in the East, and educated people throughout the empire could communicate with each other, creating a cosmopolitan culture that transcended local boundaries. Augustus boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, and it was not an empty boast. He embarked on ambitious building programs, creating monuments that glorified Rome and his own achievements. The Forum of Augustus, with its temple to Mars altar, Mars the Avenger, commemorated his victory over Caesar's assassins. The Era Pacis, the altar of peace, celebrated the peace he had brought. Theaters, baths, temples, aqueducts, Rome became a city worthy of its empire, a stage set for imperial majesty. But Augustus's greatest challenge was one he never fully solved: succession. The Republic had no mechanism for transferring power because, in theory, power belonged to the people and Senate, not to any individual. Augustus needed to find a successor who could maintain the system he had created, but he also needed to maintain the fiction that he was not establishing a dynasty. He adopted his stepson Tiberius after his preferred heirs died young, and when Augustus died in 14 of the Common Era, Tiberius became the second emperor. The precedent was established. Rome would be ruled by emperors, and they would come, officially, from the Julio-Claudian family, though adoption and marriage politics muddled the bloodlines considerably. The emperors who followed Augustus ranged from competent to catastrophic. Tiberius was capable but dour, eventually retiring to Capri and leaving the government in the hands of his Praetorian prefect Sejanus, who used his position to terrorize Rome's elite. Caligula, who followed Tiberius, started promisingly but apparently succumbed to illness or madness, becoming a tyrant whose alleged excesses, declaring himself a god, making his horse a consul, became legendary, though modern historians debate how much was true and how much was propaganda from enemies. He was assassinated by his own guards after just 4 years. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, seemed an unlikely emperor. He limped, stammered, and was considered weak by the warrior aristocracy, but proved surprisingly effective, conquering Britain and administering the empire efficiently. Nero, the last Julio-Claudian, was a patron of the arts who loved theater and music but was also implicated in numerous murders, including his own mother, and allegedly fiddled while Rome burned in the Great Fire of 64 of the Common Era. Whether Nero actually started the fire is debated, but he blamed Christians, then a small and unfamiliar sect, and launched the first imperial persecution, crucifying and burning them as scapegoats. Among the victims, tradition holds, were Peter and Paul, the apostles who had brought Christianity to Rome. Nero's reign ended in chaos. Revolts broke out in the provinces. The Senate and Praetorian Guard turned against him. In 68 of the Common Era, Nero fled Rome and committed suicide, crying, "What an artist dies in me," as he died. With no clear successor, the empire plunged into civil war. The year of the 4 emperors saw Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian claim the throne, each supported by different factions of the army. Vespasian emerged victorious, founding the Flavian dynasty and proving that emperors need not come from the old aristocracy. He was a military man, blunt and practical, who joked on his deathbed, "I think I'm becoming a god," mocking the imperial cult that deified dead emperors. Vespasian and his sons, Titus and Domitian, brought stability. Titus completed the Colosseum, that enormous amphitheater where gladiators fought and criminals were executed for the entertainment of the masses. These games, along with free grain distributions, were the famous bread and circuses that kept Rome's urban population satisfied, giving them spectacle to distract from their lack of real political power. Domitian was an effective administrator but paranoid, launching a reign of terror against senators he suspected of disloyalty. Like several predecessors, he was assassinated in 96 of the Common Era. What followed was Rome's Golden Age, the era of the five good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These emperors, spanning the period from 96 to 180 of the Common Era, governed wisely, expanded the empire to its greatest extent, and presided over an era of prosperity and cultural achievement. Nerva was elderly and ruled briefly but established an important precedent by adopting Trajan, a successful general from Spain, as his heir rather than choosing a blood relative. It suggested that ability, not birth, should determine succession. Trajan was perhaps Rome's most successful military emperor after Augustus. He conquered Dacia, in modern Romania, and launched a campaign against Parthia, capturing the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon and briefly giving Rome control of Mesopotamia. Under Trajan, the empire reached its maximum territorial extent, stretching from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf, from the Sahara to Scotland. To rule such a vast domain required not just military might but an administrative apparatus of impressive sophistication. Roads, many of which still exist today, connected every corner of the empire. Aqueducts brought fresh water to cities. A cursus publicus, an imperial post, carried messages with surprising speed. Provincial governors reported to Rome, their actions monitored by imperial agents. It was not perfect, corruption existed, provincial administration varied in quality, some areas were exploited brutally, but for its time, it represented an extraordinary achievement in governance. Hadrian, who succeeded Trajan, took a different approach. He spent most of his reign traveling through the provinces, personally inspecting defenses, addressing local concerns, beautifying cities. He built defensive walls, most famously in Britain, where Hadrian's wall stretched 80 miles across the island's narrow neck, marking the northern boundary of civilization as Romans understood it. Hadrian was an intellectual, a Philhellene who loved Greek culture and philosophy, a poet and architect who designed buildings including the Pantheon, that magnificent temple whose dome remains the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome even today. He withdrew from some of Trajan's conquests, recognizing that the empire had reached its sustainable limits, that further expansion would overextend resources and manpower. It was a strategic wisdom that later emperors would forget at their peril. Antoninus Pius lived up to his name, ruling peacefully for 23 years without major wars or crises. It was a quiet reign, perhaps the calmest in Roman history, and sometimes the absence of drama is the highest achievement. Under Antoninus, the empire simply functioned, efficiently and prosperously, the machinery of administration running smoothly, the frontiers secure, trade flowing, cities thriving. It was as close to the ideal as the ancient world achieved, a moment when it seemed that Rome had solved the puzzle of how to govern humanity, how to bring peace and prosperity to millions. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the good emperors, was a Stoic philosopher who wrote meditations on virtue and duty while campaigning on the Danube frontier against Germanic tribes pressing against Rome's borders. His meditations, private writings never intended for publication, reveal a man trying to live according to philosophical principles while bearing the burden of empire, reminding himself to be just and merciful, to not let power corrupt, to remember that death comes to emperor and slave alike. He was, in many ways, Plato's philosopher king made real, a man who would rather have studied wisdom than commanded armies but did his duty regardless. Yet even Marcus Aurelius made a decision that would prove disastrous. Unlike his predecessors who had adopted capable successors, Marcus left the empire to his biological son, Commodus, who proved unworthy of the purple. Commodus was vain, cruel, and erratic. He fancied himself a gladiator and fought in the arena, a spectacle that horrified the aristocracy, for whom physical combat was the domain of slaves and the desperate. He renamed Rome after himself, called the months of the year by names honoring his various titles, declared himself Hercules reborn. After 12 years of increasingly bizarre behavior, He was strangled in his bath in 192 of the Common Era, ending the Antonine dynasty and plunging Rome into another civil war. The 3rd century that followed would test the empire as never before. The Severan dynasty that emerged from the civil war following Commodus's death ruled for several decades, but they militarized the state, increasing army pay and size, placing military concerns above all else. Septimius Severus, the dynasty's founder, allegedly told his sons on his deathbed to enrich the soldiers and scorn all others, advice that would haunt the empire. The army became kingmaker, assassinating emperors who displeased them and elevating favorites, usually in exchange for donatives, cash bonuses paid to secure loyalty. Then, starting in 235, the empire entered what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, 50 years of near-constant chaos. In those 5 decades, Rome had more than 50 emperors, most of whom died violently after brief reigns. The frontiers crumbled. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube, raiding deep into imperial territory. The Goths sacked Athens and other Greek cities. In the east, a new Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, proved far more formidable than the Parthians they replaced. Persian armies invaded Syria and even captured a Roman emperor, Valerian, in 260, an unprecedented humiliation. Valerian died in Persian captivity, and according to hostile sources, the Persian king used his stuffed skin as a footstool. The empire fragmented. In the west, a Gallic empire broke away, controlling Gaul, Britain, and Spain. In the east, the caravan city of Palmyra under Queen Zenobia seized control of the wealthy eastern provinces. For a time, it seemed Rome might disintegrate entirely, that the empire built over centuries might collapse in a generation. Plague ravaged the population. The economy contracted as trade routes became unsafe. Cities shrank behind hastily built walls. The currency collapsed through inflation as emperors debased the coinage to pay their troops. Silver coins that had once been nearly pure became base metal with a thin silver wash. Prices spiraled upward. Tax collection became increasingly difficult and oppressive. The burden fell heaviest on the Curiales, the local aristocrats responsible for collecting taxes in their cities, who had to make up shortfalls from their own fortunes, driving many into bankruptcy. Agriculture, the foundation of the economy, suffered as farms were abandoned due to war, taxation, or plague. Large estates, the latifundia worked by slaves or increasingly by coloni, tenant farmers bound to the land, replaced small holdings. The free peasantry that had once formed Rome's backbone dwindled. The army, once staffed by Italian and provincial citizens, recruited increasingly from barbarian tribes beyond the frontiers, men who fought well but had little attachment to Roman culture or institutions. Yet somehow, Rome survived. A series of soldier emperors, men from the provinces and frontier armies, stabilized the situation through sheer determination and military skill. Claudius Gothicus defeated a massive Gothic invasion. Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275, earned the title Restorer of the World by reconquering the breakaway provinces and defeating numerous invaders. He built the Aurelian walls around Rome, massive fortifications that enclosed a much larger area than the ancient Servian walls, a visible admission that Rome itself was no longer safe from barbarian raids. Then came Diocletian, a cavalry commander from Dalmatia who became emperor in 284 and ruled until 305. Diocletian recognized that the empire was too large for one man to govern, especially given the constant military threats on multiple frontiers. He created the Tetrarchy, the rule of four, dividing the empire into eastern and western halves, each ruled by an Augustus with a junior Caesar who would eventually succeed. It was an attempt to solve the succession problem, to create a system where competent generals would be chosen as heirs rather than relying on dynastic succession, which had so often produced incompetent emperors. Diocletian also reformed the administration, dividing provinces into smaller units for easier control, separating civil and military authority, creating a larger bureaucracy to manage the empire's affairs. He reformed the army, increasing its size, creating mobile field armies that could respond to threats rather than being tied to static frontier defenses. He attempted to control the economy through the Edict on Maximum Prices, setting price ceilings for goods and services throughout the empire, though this proved largely unenforceable. And Diocletian launched the last and greatest persecution of Christians. Christianity had grown steadily since Paul brought it to Rome in the 1st century, spreading first among slaves and the urban poor, then gradually attracting converts from all classes. Christians were periodically persecuted, sometimes by imperial policy, sometimes by local initiative, accused of atheism for refusing to honor the traditional gods, of disloyalty for declining to participate in emperor worship. Most of the time, they were simply ignored, but their refusal to assimilate, their exclusive monotheism, their claim to possess absolute truth, made them convenient scapegoats during times of trouble. Diocletian's great persecution, beginning in 303, was systematic and empire-wide. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, clergy arrested and tortured, Christians forced to sacrifice to the gods or face execution. Thousands died, though the exact number is unknowable. The persecution varied in intensity by region. It was particularly brutal in the east, less consistently enforced in the west. But it failed in its ultimate goal. Christianity did not disappear. If anything, the martyrs' courage impressed observers and won converts. The blood of the martyrs, as Tertullian had written a century earlier, was the seed of the church. Diocletian's tetrarchy also failed, collapsing into civil war shortly after he abdicated in 305, the first Roman emperor to voluntarily retire, though he did so because of illness. Various claimants fought for control, and from this chaos emerged Constantine, son of one of the tetrarchs, who won a series of battles and by 324 ruled the entire empire alone. Constantine was a pivotal figure, one of those individuals whose decisions reshape history. In 312, before a crucial battle at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome, Constantine reportedly had a vision or dream in which he was told to mark his soldiers' shields with a Christian symbol and he would conquer. He did, and he won. Whether Constantine genuinely converted to Christianity or saw it as a useful tool for unifying his rule remains debated by historians, but regardless of his personal beliefs, his actions transformed both the empire and Christianity. In 313, Constantine and his co-emperor issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire, ending the persecution of Christians. Constantine went further, favoring Christianity, donating imperial property for churches, exempting clergy from certain taxes and obligations, and involving himself in theological disputes. At the Council of Nicaea in 325, called by Constantine to resolve the Arian controversy, a complex theological dispute about Christ's nature, the emperor presided, though he was not yet baptized. It was an extraordinary sight, the Roman emperor, inheritor of a pagan tradition stretching back centuries, mediating between Christian bishops, helping to define orthodox doctrine. Constantine also made a decision with vast implications. He moved the empire's capital from Rome to the Greek city of Byzantium, which he rebuilt and renamed Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The new capital, strategically located on the Bosporus Strait where Europe meets Asia, was easier to defend than Rome, closer to the wealthy eastern provinces and the frontiers where threats were greatest. Constantinople was conceived as a Christian city, adorned with churches rather than pagan temples, though Constantine also brought in artworks and treasures from across the empire to beautify it. This move symbolized a profound shift. Rome, the ancient city that had given the empire its name and identity, was becoming less central. The empire's center of gravity was moving east, to the wealthier, more populous, more urbanized eastern provinces. The West, already struggling economically and facing constant barbarian pressure, would increasingly be overshadowed. Constantine himself was baptized only on his deathbed in 337, finally fully embracing the faith he had championed, or perhaps hedging his spiritual bets one last time. Constantine's successors continued his policies, with one notable exception. His nephew Julian, who reigned from 360 to 363, attempted to revive paganism, earning him the epithet, the apostate, from Christian chroniclers. Julian was an intellectual, trained in philosophy, who believed the old gods and traditions should be preserved. He removed Christian privileges, tried to rebuild pagan temples, wrote treatises against Christianity. But his reign was brief. He died fighting the Persians, allegedly killed by a spear thrust, and legend says his last words were, "You have won, Galilean," addressing Christ. More likely he said nothing so dramatic, but the legend captures the truth: Christianity had won. Julian's successors were Christian, and by the end of the 4th century, Christianity was not just tolerated but had become the empire's official religion. Theodosius I, ruling from 379 to 395, made Christianity the state religion and banned pagan worship. Ancient temples were closed or converted to churches. The Olympic Games, celebrated for over 1,000 years, were discontinued as pagan rituals. An entire religious and cultural tradition was being dismantled. But while the empire was transforming religiously, it was crumbling politically and militarily. The Western Empire faced mounting pressure from barbarian tribes. These barbarians, a Greek term meaning those who spoke unintelligibly, who were not civilized Greeks or Romans, were not uniformly savage. Many had complex societies, rich artistic traditions, and had been in contact with Rome for centuries. Roman merchants traded with them. Their warriors served in Roman armies. Their leaders learned Latin and admired Roman culture. But they wanted land, security, and opportunity, and the empire, weakened by internal problems, could no longer easily prevent them from taking it. The Huns, nomadic warriors from Central Asia, swept westward in the late 4th century, displacing Gothic tribes that had settled near the Danube. These Goths, desperate and terrified, begged permission to cross into Roman territory. The Emperor Valens allowed it, hoping to settle them as farmer soldiers, but Roman officials abused and exploited them. In 378, at Adrianople, the Goths annihilated a Roman army and killed Valens. It was a shock comparable to Cannae, proof that Rome could no longer dominate militarily, that barbarians could defeat legions in pitched battle. The empire recovered temporarily, but the situation was fundamentally unsustainable. More tribes pressed against the frontiers. The Rhine froze in the winter of 406, and a coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed into Gaul. The western provinces descended into chaos. Britain was abandoned, the legions withdrawn never to return. The British, who had been Roman for 3.5 centuries, were left to fend for themselves against Saxon raiders. Spain was overrun. Even Italy was not safe. In 410, Alaric the Goth led his warriors to the gates of Rome and sacked the city. It was the first time Rome had fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years, since those Gauls had looted the city back in 390 before the Common Era. The psychological shock was immense. Rome, the eternal city, was not eternal after all. Saint Jerome, the scholar who translated the Bible into Latin, lamented that the whole world had perished in one city. Saint Augustine, the great theologian, wrote The City of God, partly to address the crisis, arguing that earthly cities rise and fall but the heavenly city endures, attempting to shift Christian focus from terrestrial to spiritual concerns. The Western Empire lingered for another 66 years after the sack of Rome, but it was a hollow shell. Real power belonged to barbarian generals who made and unmade emperors. The Western armies were composed largely of barbarian federates, tribal groups who fought for Rome in exchange for land and Roman titles. Provinces fell away one by one. The Vandals, pushed out of Spain, crossed to North Africa and conquered that wealthy region, cutting off its grain supply to Rome. From their base in Carthage, they launched pirate raids across the Mediterranean. In 455, they sacked Rome again, more thoroughly than Alaric had, spending 2 weeks systematically looting everything of value. Attila the Hun, whose mounted archers terrorized both halves of the empire in the mid-5th century, invaded Gaul in 451. A combined Roman and barbarian army stopped him at the Catalonian plains in one of the few significant military victories the West managed in this period. Attila turned to Italy the next year, but plague and logistics forced him to withdraw. He died in 453, and his empire fragmented, but the damage to Rome was done. The last Western emperors were children or incompetents, puppet rulers controlled by Germanic generals. Romulus Augustulus, a teenage boy whose name ironically combined the legendary founder of Rome with the first emperor, was installed in 475. He ruled less than a year. In 476, the Germanic general Odoacer deposed him, pensioned him off to a villa in Campania, and simply declined to appoint a replacement. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruled Italy as the Eastern Emperor's viceroy in theory, though he was effectively an independent king. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a bang but with a whimper. There was no final battle, no dramatic last stand. An institution that had lasted for over 500 years, that had ruled most of the known world, simply ceased to exist because no one with power saw any reason to continue the charade. Few at the time realized they had witnessed the end of an era. Many expected another general would claim the purple, that the empire would be restored as it had been after previous crises. But it never was. The Western Empire was gone. Yet Rome endured in changed forms. The Eastern Empire, which we call Byzantine though its inhabitants always called themselves Romans, continued for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, administration, and culture in a Greek-speaking, Christian form. Constantinople would stand unconquered until 1453, when Ottoman cannons finally breached its massive walls. The Roman legal tradition survived through Justinian's codification in the 6th century, becoming the foundation of civil law systems across Europe and beyond. The Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome, preserved Latin and elements of Roman administrative structure, becoming in some ways the empire's heir in the West. The Germanic kingdoms that emerged from the empire's ruins, the Franks in Gaul, the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths, and later Lombards in Italy, all claimed Roman legitimacy, appointed Roman administrators, and adopted Roman customs. The idea of Rome proved more durable than the reality. Charlemagne was crowned Roman emperor by the Pope in 800, reviving the Western imperial title and founding what would become the Holy Roman Empire, which lasted in various forms until 1806. The Russian Tsars, the word itself derived from Caesar, claimed to be Rome's successors after Constantinople fell. Even America's founders looked to the Roman Republic for inspiration, creating a Senate, using Roman architectural styles for government buildings, adopting the eagle as their symbol. But why did Rome fall? Historians have debated this question for centuries, offering theories ranging from moral decay to lead poisoning to climate change. Edward Gibbon, whose monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire shaped how generations viewed Rome, blamed Christianity, arguing that other worldly religions sapped the martial virtues that had built the empire. Others have blamed economic factors, inflation, overtaxation, the shift from free labor to serfdom. Some point to disease, noting that plague epidemics in the 2nd and 3rd centuries significantly reduced population. Still others emphasize military factors, the difficulty of defending immense frontiers, the barbarization of the army, the loss of military superiority. The truth, most modern historians agree, is that no single factor explains Rome's fall but rather a complex interaction of problems that reinforced each other. Economic decline made it harder to support the military. Military weakness invited invasion. Invasion disrupted agriculture and trade. Disrupted trade worsened economic decline. Political instability, with emperors constantly overthrown, prevented consistent policy. The empire's very size, once a source of strength, became a vulnerability when central authority weakened and provinces had to fend for themselves. Moreover, fall may be the wrong word. Rome transformed rather than disappeared. The empire's population did not vanish in 476. Cities, though smaller and poorer, continued. Christianity, though it might have contributed to the empire's political collapse, preserved much of Roman culture through medieval darkness. Latin evolved into the Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, spoken by hundreds of millions today. Roman engineering principles influenced architecture and construction for centuries. Roman law shaped legal thought into the modern era. Perhaps we should think of Rome not as a civilization that fell but as one that scattered like seeds, germinating in different soil, growing into new forms. Medieval Europe, the Islamic caliphates, the Byzantine Empire, all carried Roman DNA, adapting it to their own circumstances. The Renaissance consciously revived Roman ideals, art, and literature. The Enlightenment looked to Rome for political models. Even our calendar, with its months named for Roman gods and emperors, connects us to that ancient world. What remains most striking about Rome is not its fall but its extraordinary rise and longevity. A city that began as farming settlements on 7 hills built the largest empire the Western world had yet seen. For centuries, Rome brought unprecedented peace and unity to the Mediterranean basin. Under Roman rule, a merchant could travel from Britain to Syria speaking 2 languages, Latin and Greek, and find Roman law, Roman roads, Roman cities the entire way. This Pax Romana enabled commerce, cultural exchange, and the spread of ideas on a scale never before achieved. Roman engineering was astonishing. Aqueducts that carried water dozens of miles using only gravity, some of which still function today. Roads so well built that many remain in use 2,000 years later. The Pantheon's dome, an architectural marvel that would not be equaled for over 1,000 years. The Colosseum, which could seat 50,000 spectators and had a retractable awning to shade them from the sun. Public baths with sophisticated heating systems. Apartment buildings several stories high. These were not the achievements of a primitive people. Roman literature gave us Virgil's Aeneid, an epic that traced Rome's legendary origins and influenced every subsequent epic poem. Ovid's Metamorphoses collected mythological tales with wit and psychological insight. Cicero's philosophical works and speeches provided models of rhetoric and thought. Livy and Tacitus chronicled Roman history with varying degrees of reliability but considerable literary skill. Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius developed Stoic philosophy that still resonates with modern readers seeking meaning and ethical guidance. Roman law, perhaps Rome's most enduring legacy, established principles that underpin modern legal systems. The idea that laws should be written and publicly accessible, that legal proceedings should follow established procedures, that individuals have rights and responsibilities, that contracts are binding, these concepts, refined by Roman jurists over centuries, shaped how civilizations after Rome organized themselves. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Justinian, preserved this legal tradition and transmitted it to medieval Europe, where it was studied and adapted, eventually influencing systems from Louisiana's civil law to the European Union's legal framework. Rome also left us language. Latin, though no longer spoken as a native language, lives on in scientific nomenclature, medical terminology, legal phrases, and church liturgy. Countless English words derive from Latin. The Romance languages evolved directly from the vulgar Latin spoken in different provinces. Even languages not descended from Latin borrowed extensively from it. To learn Latin is to unlock connections across multiple languages and access literature spanning 2 millennia. But beyond these tangible legacies, Rome gave us something more intangible, a template for empire itself. Every subsequent empire, Byzantine, Islamic, Mongol, Spanish, British, looked back to Rome as a model, whether to emulate or avoid its mistakes. The concept of an ecumenical civilization, a universal state bringing diverse peoples under common administration and law, derives from Roman precedent. So does the darker side, the use of military might to subjugate others, the extraction of tribute from conquered peoples, the imposition of one culture's values on others. Rome's legacy is complex and contradictory, both inspiring and cautionary. Walking through Rome today, the ancient and modern coexist in fascinating ways. The Pantheon functions as a church, its pagan origins transformed but the building itself intact. The Colosseum stands as a tourist attraction and symbol of the city, though whether it symbolizes Roman grandeur or Roman cruelty depends on perspective. Fragments of the imperial forums lie surrounded by modern streets. The Victor Emmanuel Monument, built in the 19th century, dwarfs nearby ancient ruins, a reminder that every age tries to outdo its predecessors in monumental architecture. But Rome's physical ruins are not limited to the capital. Across the former empire, Roman remains testify to the extent and durability of Roman civilization. Hadrian's Wall stretches across northern England. The Pont du Gard aqueduct spans a river valley in southern France. The theater at Orange, the amphitheater at El Jem in Tunisia, the library facade at Ephesus in Turkey, the triumphal arch at Thamagati in Algeria, everywhere Rome ruled, it built, and much of what it built has survived. These ruins speak to us across the centuries, reminding us of human ambition and human frailty, of civilization's capacity to create beauty and order and their equally powerful capacity for destruction and oppression. Rome enslaved millions, crucified rebels, massacred peoples who resisted conquest. Roman entertainment included watching humans and animals kill each other in elaborate staged hunts and gladiatorial combats. Roman imperialism extracted wealth from provinces to enrich the capital, sometimes leaving conquered regions impoverished. We cannot romanticize Rome without acknowledging its violence and exploitation. Yet we cannot dismiss its achievements either. Roman citizenship, which started as the privilege of a few thousand and eventually extended to virtually everyone in the empire, represented a revolutionary idea. That political identity need not depend on ethnicity or birthplace, that diverse peoples could share a common citizenship. The Constitutio Antoniniana of 212, which granted citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, was a remarkable moment in human history, creating a truly cosmopolitan civilization. Roman religious tolerance, though never absolute and subject to exceptions, generally allowed conquered peoples to maintain their traditional gods and practices. The Romans added foreign deities to their pantheon, identified them with Roman gods through a process called Interpretatio Romana, and mostly left local cults alone unless they threatened public order. This pragmatic tolerance enabled the empire to integrate diverse peoples without the religious conflicts that would plague later civilizations. Rome's approach to assimilation, offering benefits to those who adopted Roman culture while not absolutely requiring it, proved effective for centuries. A provincial could become Roman by learning Latin, serving in the army, adopting Roman dress and customs, without completely abandoning his native identity. This flexibility, this willingness to expand what being Roman meant, strengthened rather than weakened the empire. Some of Rome's best emperors came from the provinces: Trajan and Hadrian from Spain, Septimius Severus from Libya, Diocletian from the Balkans. The empire was genuinely multicultural, a patchwork of peoples united by common institutions and interests rather than shared ethnicity. The Roman army exemplified this diversity. By the imperial period, legions recruited from across the empire. A legion stationed in Britain might include recruits from Syria, North Africa, and the Balkans. Auxiliary units, originally composed of non-citizen provincials, brought their own fighting styles and equipment. Germanic cavalry, North African light infantry, Syrian archers. Rome's military success depended on integrating these diverse forces into an effective fighting machine. Military service became a path to citizenship, social mobility, and economic security. After 20 years of service, a veteran received a discharge bonus and land, enabling him to settle and raise a family. This system turned potential enemies into loyal soldiers and eventually into Roman citizens. Yet this same system contained the seeds of Rome's decline. When economic troubles made discharge bonuses and land grants difficult to provide, soldier loyalty wavered. When the frontiers became more dangerous and the empire less able to protect its interior, military service became less attractive to citizens, forcing greater reliance on barbarian federates whose loyalty was always conditional. The army that had built the empire gradually became a threat to its stability, with different units supporting rival claimants to the throne, plunging the empire into civil wars that destroyed what external enemies could not. The 3rd century crisis demonstrated both Rome's resilience and its limitations. The empire survived 50 years of chaos, proof of the strength of the institutions and infrastructure built over centuries. Cities, even under attack, maintained some administration. The road network, though less secure, continued to function. Agricultural production, though diminished, did not collapse entirely. Roman identity persisted even when central authority fractured. This speaks to deep structural strengths in Roman civilization. But the crisis also revealed vulnerabilities. The economy never fully recovered. The currency remained debased, inflation endemic. The tax burden, increasingly onerous, drove people to seek protection from powerful landlords, effectively creating a proto-feudal system where free peasants became dependent coloni, bound to estates. The curiales, the local aristocrats who had been the backbone of city administration, were trapped in a system that required them to collect ever more difficult taxes on pain of personal ruin. Many abandoned their cities for their country estates, or sought exemption through military or church service. The Roman state became more authoritarian in response to crisis. Diocletian's reforms created a larger bureaucracy, more rigid social hierarchies, more extensive regulation of economic life. People were increasingly bound to their occupations, their father's status determining their own. Sons of soldiers had to become soldiers. Sons of bakers had to become bakers. It was an attempt to ensure the state could extract the resources it needed to survive, but it reduced social mobility and innovation. The dynamic, relatively open society of the early empire gave way to a more static, controlled system in late antiquity. Christianity's rise occurred against this backdrop of crisis and transformation. It offered a compelling message, that suffering has meaning, that this world's injustices will be rectified in the next, that every person, regardless of status, has infinite worth in God's eyes. For slaves, for the poor, for women, all groups with limited status in traditional Roman society, Christianity offered dignity and community. Christian communities provided social services, caring for widows, orphans, and the sick, creating networks of mutual support that the Roman state increasingly failed to provide. Christian martyrs, refusing to sacrifice to the gods even under torture, demonstrated a commitment to their faith that impressed even their persecutors. The early church father Tertullian wrote that he had not been born a Christian but had become one, suggesting that Christianity's appeal lay not in tradition but in its message and community. Converts came from all classes, though the religion spread first among urbanites and only gradually penetrated the countryside. Paganus, the Latin word for rural dweller, became the root of pagan, reflecting Christianity's urban origins. Constantine's conversion, whatever its exact motivation, legitimized and empowered Christianity, but it also changed the religion fundamentally. A faith born in opposition to temporal power now allied with it. Bishops became important imperial officials. church councils, once clandestine meetings of persecuted believers, now convened with imperial sponsorship in imperial palaces. Theological disputes, once purely religious matters, became state concerns because the emperor wanted religious unity to support political unity. This fusion of church and state had profound consequences. Christianity became less a voluntary community and more an expected norm. Pagans faced increasing pressure to convert. Jews, who had generally been tolerated in the Roman Empire despite occasional conflicts, found their status deteriorating as Christian emperors enacted increasingly discriminatory laws. Heretics, Christians whose theological views deviated from orthodox consensus, faced persecution from fellow Christians with an intensity pagans rarely experienced. The ecumenical councils of the 4th and 5th centuries established orthodox doctrine but also defined heresy, creating boundaries and divisions within Christianity. The theological disputes seem arcane to modern eyes, arguments about the nature of Christ's divinity, the relationship between Father and Son, the role of the Holy Spirit. But these debates mattered deeply to their participants, who believed that correct understanding of God was necessary for salvation. The Arian controversy, the Nestorian dispute, the Monophysite question, these weren't mere intellectual exercises but struggles over fundamental truth. Emperors intervened, exiling bishops, calling councils, enforcing creeds, because religious division threatened the empire's unity. Yet despite imperial efforts, Christianity never achieved complete unity. Different regions developed different emphases. The Western Church, centered on Rome and increasingly dominated by the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, emphasized hierarchy, authority, and legal precision, reflecting Roman administrative tradition. The Eastern Church, centered on Constantinople but including ancient patriarchates at Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, emphasized theology, mysticism, and conciliar decision-making, reflecting Greek philosophical tradition. These differences, initially manageable, would eventually culminate in the Great Schism of 1054, splitting Christianity into Catholic and Orthodox branches. In the West, as imperial authority crumbled, the Church filled the vacuum. Bishops became civic leaders in their cities when imperial governors disappeared. Monasteries preserved literacy and learning when secular institutions collapsed. The Pope, as Bishop of Rome and heir to Peter, claimed spiritual authority over all Christians and increasingly temporal authority as well. The Church owned vast estates, collected tithes, administered law through ecclesiastical courts. In some ways, the Catholic Church became the Western Empire's heir, maintaining Latin as its language, Rome as its capital, and hierarchy as its organizing principle. The barbarian kingdoms that emerged in the Western Empire's ruins gradually converted to Christianity, often through their royal families. Clovis, king of the Franks, converted around 500, bringing his people with him and allying with the Catholic Church against Arian Germanic tribes. The Anglo-Saxons in Britain, initially pagan after driving out or assimilating the Romano-British population, were converted by missions from both Rome and Ireland in the 6th and 7th centuries. The Lombards in Italy eventually converted. Visigothic Spain abandoned Arianism for Catholicism. By 700, Western Europe was a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, but they were Christian kingdoms, and they acknowledged, at least in theory, the spiritual authority of Rome. This Christian Europe was poorer, less urban, less literate than the Roman Empire had been. Cities shrank dramatically. Long-distance trade declined. The sophisticated market economy gave way to localized subsistence agriculture. Slavery continued but was supplemented by serfdom, peasants bound to estates, owing labor to lords in exchange for protection. Literacy retreated to monasteries. The classical learning preserved in thousands of manuscripts across the empire was largely lost, surviving in fragmentary form, copied by monks who sometimes barely understood what they transcribed. Yet even in this apparent darkness, connections to Rome persisted. Monasteries followed the rule of Saint Benedict, written in 6th century Italy, which created a structured communal life balancing prayer, work, and study. Monks copied classical texts alongside scripture, preserving works by Virgil, Cicero, and other Roman authors. The Church's liturgy used Latin, maintaining that language even as vernacular Romance languages evolved. Church law drew on Roman legal principles. Bishops and abbots held territories and exercised authority modeled partly on Roman precedents. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries represented a deliberate attempt to revive Roman learning and administration. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, conquered most of Western Europe, creating an empire that rivaled Rome in extent though not sophistication. He established schools, invited scholars to his court, standardized liturgy and script. When Pope Leo III crowned him Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 800, it was both audacious and logical. Audacious because the Roman Empire still existed in Constantinople and its emperor had not approved this Western rival. Logical because Charlemagne ruled territories Rome had once held and was consciously reviving Roman traditions. The Holy Roman Empire that descended from Charlemagne's coronation would last 1,000 years, though Voltaire famously quipped that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. It was a complex federation of German principalities, kingdoms, and city-states, nominally united under an elected emperor who claimed Roman legitimacy. The empire's ideology drew heavily on Rome, with emperors styling themselves as continuers of Roman tradition, adopting Roman titles and symbols, viewing their rule as divinely ordained to govern Christendom. Meanwhile, in the East, the Byzantine Empire continued as the direct successor to Rome. Its inhabitants called themselves Romaeoi, Romans, throughout its existence. Its emperors maintained the administrative system, albeit modified over centuries. Roman law, codified by Justinian in the 6th century, governed the empire. The Byzantine army, though different from the old legions, saw itself as inheritor of Roman military tradition. Constantinople, with its massive walls and magnificent churches, was the empire's jewel, rivaling or exceeding Rome's ancient glory. Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565, attempted to restore the Roman Empire in full. His generals, Belisarius and Narses, reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and part of Spain from the Visigoths. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean was nearly reunited under Roman rule. But the cost was immense. Italy was devastated by 20 years of warfare. The conquests overstrained Byzantine resources. Plague, possibly the first appearance of bubonic plague in Europe, ravaged the empire in the 540s, killing millions and weakening it permanently. After Justinian, Byzantium faced existential threats. The Lombards conquered much of Italy, limiting Byzantine control to Ravenna, Roman the southern regions. The Persians launched devastating invasions in the early 7th century, capturing Syria, Egypt, and even besieging Constantinople itself. The Emperor Heraclius eventually defeated the Persians in a brilliant campaign, restoring the eastern provinces, but both empires were exhausted. And then, from the Arabian Peninsula, a new force emerged that would reshape the Mediterranean world forever. Islam, preached by the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century, united the Arab tribes and created a religious and political movement of extraordinary dynamism. Within decades of Muhammad's death in 632, Arab armies conquered Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and North Africa. The Byzantine Empire lost its wealthiest provinces, the lands that had been Rome's breadbasket and treasury. The Mediterranean, which Rome had called our sea, was now divided between Christian and Muslim powers, a division that would define the region for centuries. The Muslim conquests permanently severed connections between the empire's former eastern and western territories. North Africa, which had been Latin-speaking and Christian, became Arabic-speaking and Muslim. Egypt, conquered in the 6th century before the Common Era by Alexander and Greek ruled for centuries, then Roman for 6 more, now entered the Islamic world. The great cities of the East, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, came under Muslim rule. Only Constantinople and portions of Anatolia remained to Byzantium in the east. The Byzantine Empire, drastically reduced but still powerful, adapted to survive. It became more Greek and less Latin in character, though its people still called themselves Romans. Greek replaced Latin as the administrative language. The army reorganized into themes, military districts where soldier farmers held land in exchange for military service, a system remarkably similar to what Germanic kingdoms developed in the West. Iconoclasm, a theological controversy over religious images, convulsed the empire for over a century, with emperors and patriarchs debating whether icons were legitimate aids to devotion or idolatrous violations of God's commandments. Through all these transformations, Byzantium preserved the idea of Rome. Its emperors claimed universal authority, at least in theory, over all Christians. Its scholars copied ancient texts, maintaining learning that the West had largely lost. Byzantine missionaries spread Christianity and Greek culture to the Slavic peoples, creating a Byzantine Commonwealth that included Bulgaria, Serbia, and eventually Russia. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Russians claimed the Byzantine inheritance, with Moscow styling itself the Third Rome, successor to Rome and Constantinople. But let us return westward, to the centuries following Rome's fall, when Europe was finding its footing in a post-Roman world. The period from roughly 500 to 1000 was once called the Dark Ages, a term historians now avoid because it suggests a uniformity of decline that wasn't accurate. Yes, Western Europe was poorer, less urbanized, less literate than the Roman Empire had been. But it was not stagnant. New institutions emerged. Germanic law codes blended with Roman legal traditions. Monasticism preserved and transmitted learning. Agricultural innovations, including the heavy plow and three-field rotation, gradually increased productivity. Trade never entirely ceased, and by the 9th and 10th centuries, it was reviving. The Viking Age, from roughly 800 to 1100, brought new chaos but also new energy. Norse raiders attacked coastal regions and river valleys, plundering monasteries and towns. But Vikings were also traders and settlers. They established Dublin, colonized Iceland and Greenland, reached North America. They founded the Duchy of Normandy in France and the Varangian Principalities in Russia. They converted to Christianity and integrated into European society, their descendants becoming French, English, and Russian. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 exemplified this integration. William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, was a Viking descendant who spoke French, conquered an England ruled by Anglo-Saxons, themselves Germanic invaders who had conquered Roman Britain 6 centuries earlier. William brought continental feudalism, Norman administration, and a new aristocracy to England, creating a hybrid culture that was neither purely English nor purely Norman but something new. Europe in the High Middle Ages, from roughly 1000 to 1300, was dynamic and expansive. Population grew. New lands were brought under cultivation. Cities revived and flourished. Trade routes expanded, connecting Western Europe to the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, India, and China. Universities were founded, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, creating institutions for higher learning that have endured to the present. Gothic cathedrals rose, engineering marvels that rivaled Rome's architectural achievements and expressed medieval Christianity's soaring aspirations. The Crusades, launched in 1095 when Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem from Muslim rule, reflected Europe's new confidence and aggression. For 2 centuries, European knights and common soldiers campaigned in the eastern Mediterranean, establishing crusader states, trading and fighting with Muslims and Byzantine Christians. The Crusades failed in their stated goal. Jerusalem was held briefly but lost permanently. but they increased contact between Europe and more sophisticated civilizations, exposing Europeans to goods, ideas, and technologies they eagerly adopted. This revival drew on Rome's legacy. Medieval scholars rediscovered classical texts, often through Arabic translations, sparking intellectual ferment. Aristotle's works, preserved by Islamic scholars, returned to Western Europe and revolutionized philosophy and theology. Roman law, studied at Italian universities, influenced the development of canon law and eventually secular legal systems. Kings and emperors claimed descent from Roman rulers or authority from Roman precedents. Yet medieval Europe was not simply Rome reborn. Feudalism, with its complex web of personal loyalties, obligations, and land tenure, differed fundamentally from Roman administrative structures. The Christian Church, dominant in ways the old pagan priesthood never was, shaped every aspect of life. Chivalry, with its emphasis on honor, martial prowess, and service to ladies, was a distinctly medieval creation, though it drew partly on Roman military virtues. Medieval literature, from Arthurian romances to Dante's Divine Comedy, created new forms and themes while occasionally acknowledging classical influences. The Renaissance, beginning in 14th century Italy and spreading across Europe over the next 2 centuries, represented a more conscious revival of classical civilization. Renaissance thinkers believed they were emerging from medieval darkness into a rebirth, rinascimento, of ancient learning and values. They studied Roman texts intensively, sought out forgotten manuscripts, learned Greek to read works in original languages. They imitated classical literary styles, adopted classical architectural forms, sculpted and painted with techniques inspired by ancient art. Renaissance humanism emphasized human dignity, potential, and achievement rather than medieval Christianity's focus on sin and salvation. It celebrated the studia humanitatis, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, moral philosophy, the liberal arts that made one fully human. Figures like Petrarch, Erasmus, and Thomas More studied classical authors not just for information but for moral and philosophical guidance, believing that ancient wisdom could illuminate contemporary problems. Renaissance artists looked to Roman models. Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon's dome when designing Florence Cathedral's dome. Michelangelo sculpted figures with classical proportions and poses. Raphael painted philosophers in architectural settings inspired by Roman buildings. Renaissance architects revived classical orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Roman building types like the Basilica and Triumphal Arch. Cities were redesigned with squares, boulevards, and facades that evoked Rome's ancient grandeur. This fascination with Rome was selective and interpretive. Renaissance thinkers emphasized certain aspects of Roman civilization, republican virtue, Ciceronian eloquence, Stoic philosophy, while ignoring others. They idealized ancient Rome, projecting their own values onto it, creating a classical tradition that was as much invention as recovery. But this imaginative engagement with the past shaped European culture profoundly. The Renaissance helped create the modern world's scholarly disciplines, artistic traditions, and political concepts. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517 when Martin Luther challenged Catholic practices, fractured Western Christianity but maintained connections to Rome. Reformers like Luther and Calvin studied scripture in original languages, read church fathers, and debated theology using tools developed in classical and medieval scholarship. They rejected papal authority in various Catholic doctrines, but they retained Latin as a scholarly language, maintained universities, and preserved much of Christian intellectual tradition. The Catholic Counter-Reformation responded with its own reforms and reassertions. The Council of Trent clarified Catholic doctrine and discipline. New religious orders like the Jesuits spread Catholic education and missionary work globally. Baroque art and architecture celebrated Catholic triumphalism with dramatic, emotional intensity that contrasted with Renaissance classicism but still drew on Roman grandeur. As Europe entered the early modern period, Rome remained a cultural touchstone. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries turned to classical models, particularly the Roman Republic, for political inspiration. Enlightenment thinkers admired Roman civic virtue, republican government, and rational legal systems. They studied Roman history to understand how republics functioned and why they failed, lessons they believed relevant to their own times. The American and French revolutions explicitly invoked Rome. America's founders designed a republic with a Senate, borrowed architectural styles for their capital, and debated whether they were creating a new Rome or avoiding its mistakes. French revolutionaries renamed months and adopted Roman symbols like the fasces, idealizing Republican Rome while eventually producing Napoleon, who crowned himself emperor and consciously modeled his rule on Roman emperors, campaigning across Europe, creating a legal code that drew on Roman law, and spreading French influence much as Rome had spread its culture. The 19th century saw yet another Roman revival. The British Empire, at its height, compared itself to Rome, seeing parallels in global reach, civilizing mission, and administrative competence. British public schools taught Latin and Greek, educated the colonial administrators and military officers who governed a quarter of the world's population. Rudyard Kipling's poetry about imperial duty echoed Roman themes. The British Museum collected classical antiquities, including the Elgin marbles, controversial then and now. The concept of empire itself, both as political reality and ideological construct, owes much to Rome. Empires from the Mongols to the Ottomans to the Spanish acknowledged Rome as the imperial model. When empires sought legitimacy, they traced connections, real or imagined, to Rome. This Roman legacy has both inspired and troubled the modern world. The ideal of universal civilization, of bringing order and law to diverse peoples, has motivated nation-building and imperialism alike. The darker side, conquest, exploitation, cultural suppression, also echoes Rome's methods. The 20th century's totalitarian regimes appropriated Roman symbols. Mussolini's fascist Italy explicitly claimed Roman inheritance, adopted the fasces as its symbol, and attempted to recreate a Mediterranean empire. Hitler's Third Reich, claiming to be the third incarnation of Roman imperial glory after the Holy Roman Empire and the German Empire, used classical architecture and references to legitimize tyranny. The Soviet Union, officially anti-imperial, nevertheless built massive neoclassical structures and maintained a centralized administrative system that Roman bureaucrats might have recognized. Yet Rome's legacy extends far beyond politics and war. Roman engineering principles still inform how we build bridges, aqueducts, and roads. Concrete, perfected by Roman engineers, remains a fundamental construction material. Urban planning concepts, the grid layout, public squares, zoning for different activities, derive partly from Roman cities. Infrastructure provision as a public responsibility, a Roman innovation, underpins modern governance. Latin remains the language of science, law, and medicine. Botanical and zoological nomenclature uses Latin binomial names. Medical terms and anatomical structures have Latin names. Legal phrases, habeas corpus, ex post facto, mens rea, are integral to legal discourse. The Catholic Church still uses Latin for official documents and traditional liturgy, maintaining an unbroken linguistic connection to ancient Rome spanning 2 millennia. Roman mythology and literature continue to inspire. Ovid's Metamorphoses provide stories that artists have depicted for centuries. Virgil's Aeneid influenced epics from Dante to Milton. Roman gods, though no longer worshipped, populate Western cultural imagination. Wednesday is Woden's day in English but derives from the Roman Mercury. March is Mars's month. July and August honor Julius Caesar and Augustus. Our calendar is a Roman legacy, slightly adjusted but fundamentally unchanged. Roman political concepts shape modern democracies and republics. The separation of powers, checks and balances, The idea of citizenship with rights and responsibilities, the concept of rule of law rather than arbitrary power, these principles, though developed and modified over centuries, have Roman roots. The United States Senate, the French Republic, countless modern institutions acknowledge this Roman inheritance in their names and structures. Yet as we contemplate Rome's legacy, we must also acknowledge its limitations and contradictions. Rome enslaved millions. Its empire was built on conquest and maintained through violence. Its vaunted legal system excluded most people from full participation. Its celebrated literature was produced by a tiny elite for an elite audience. Roman peace, the Pax Romana, meant peace for Romans and those who submitted to Rome, but it was imposed through military might and maintained through the ever-present threat of force. Moreover, Rome's influence has been unevenly distributed. Non-European cultures have different relationships with Rome's legacy or none at all. China's civilization developed independently, with its own political philosophies and administrative traditions. The Islamic world engaged with Rome's heritage through the Byzantine Empire and classical texts but created its own synthesis. African and Asian societies colonized by European empires often had Rome's legacy imposed upon them rather than adopting it voluntarily. In our globalized, multicultural world, the question arises, should Rome still matter? Is Roman history just another culture's story, interesting but not especially relevant to non-Western peoples? Or does Rome's role in shaping global modernity, through European colonialism, through the spread of Christianity, through legal and political concepts that became, for better or worse, globally influential, make it everyone's concern? Perhaps the answer lies in approaching Rome neither as an ideal to be emulated nor as a villain to be condemned, but as a complex historical reality to be understood. Rome's achievements were real. It created unprecedented peace and unity across vast territories, developed sophisticated legal and administrative systems, produced literature and art of enduring value, and fostered a cosmopolitan culture that transcended ethnicity. But Rome's failures and injustices were equally real. It enslaved millions, conquered brutally, could be wasteful and cruel, and eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Rome reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, that nothing human is permanent, that even the mightiest empires eventually crumble. The ruins scattered across 3 continents testify to past grandeur and present mortality. They remind us that we too are building civilizations that will one day become ruins for future archaeologists to study. This awareness should inspire both humility and determination. Humility about our own achievements, which time will judge more harshly than we judge ourselves, and determination to build well nonetheless, to create things of value that might endure or at least inspire those who come after. The Roman story is ultimately a human story, of people trying to create order from chaos, meaning from randomness, permanence from transience. The Romans succeeded remarkably for a time, then failed as all human endeavors eventually fail. But in the attempt, they created something that transcended their own time and place, that influenced countless subsequent civilizations, that still speaks to us across the millennia. Walking through Rome today, surrounded by ruins and modernity intermingled, one senses the layers of history, the accumulated weight of centuries. The Pantheon, still standing after nearly 2,000 years, its dome open to the sky, light pouring through the oculus, creates a space that still inspires awe. The Colosseum, damaged by earthquakes and stone robbers but still massive and imposing, reminds us both of Roman engineering prowess and of the brutal entertainments that crowded its stands. The Forum, once the center of the world's greatest empire, now a jumble of broken columns and partial structures, requires imagination to reconstruct. These ruins are silent now, but they once echoed with voices, senators debating policy, auctioneers selling slaves, merchants haggling over prices, priests performing sacrifices, crowds cheering gladiators. Millions of lives were lived in the shadow of these buildings, lives we can barely imagine, people who loved and suffered and hoped and feared much as we do. They thought their civilization would last forever. they were wrong. But in being wrong, they left us something precious, the knowledge that civilizations are fragile, that we must tend them carefully, that decline is not inevitable but also not impossible, that human achievements require constant renewal and rededication. Rome teaches us that empires built on military might alone cannot endure, that economic exploitation eventually exhausts itself, that political systems must adapt or ossify, that cultural vitality requires openness to new influences even as it maintains continuity with the past. Rome also teaches us that cultures can be remarkably resilient, that ideas and institutions can survive even when the political structures that created them collapse, that human creativity finds ways to preserve and transmit knowledge across centuries of chaos. Perhaps most importantly, Rome teaches us about legacy itself. The Romans were acutely conscious of their ancestors, honoring family traditions, venerating the mos maiorum, the way of the elders. They built monuments to outlast themselves, wrote histories to preserve their deeds, created institutions designed for permanence. They understood that humans are mortal but that what we create might transcend our individual lives. This consciousness of legacy, this attempt to speak to the future, to leave something of value for those who come after, is itself a gift from Rome. As our journey through Roman history comes to its close, we find ourselves standing where we began, beside the Tiber River, where shepherds once tended flocks on 7 hills. So much has changed since those simple beginnings. A city became a republic. A republic became an empire. An empire divided, transformed, and eventually fell, yet never entirely disappeared. The Tiber still flows, as it has for thousands of years, indifferent to human history, carrying water to the sea as it always has and always will. The stars above Rome are the same stars that Roman soldiers watched from their camps, that slaves glimpsed from their quarters, that emperors observed from their palaces. The human drama has unfolded beneath these stars for countless generations, each believing their own time uniquely important, each eventually fading into history. We are no different. We too will become history, our accomplishments and failures judged by people we will never know, who will sift through our ruins seeking to understand how we lived and what we valued. But tonight, in this peaceful hour, we need not worry about posterity's judgments. We have traveled together through centuries, witnessed the rise and fall of the greatest empire the Western world has known, seen human beings at their best and worst, observed the grand sweep of history and the countless small moments that comprise it. We have seen that history is not just the story of kings and generals but of ordinary people whose lives, though largely unrecorded, were no less real, no less valuable. The Roman story is over, but its echoes continue. In the languages we speak, the laws we follow, the buildings we construct, the political ideas we debate, Rome persists. Not as a living civilization but as a memory, an influence, a reference point. We are all, in some sense, Rome's heirs, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we celebrate or regret that inheritance. And so we come to the end of this long journey through time, this exploration of human ambition and achievement, of glory and decline, of an empire that shaped the world and was shaped by it. The night has deepened around us. The stories have been told. The past has been remembered. It is time, dear listener, to rest, to let these tales settle into your mind like sediment drifting to the bottom of a quiet stream. Perhaps you are already drifting towards sleep, your breathing slowing, your thoughts becoming dreams. That is well. History is not just about learning facts but about connecting with the human experience across time, feeling the continuity that binds us to those who came before. As you sleep, know that countless others have slept in this same world, under these same stars, some in palaces and some in hovels, some victorious and some defeated, but all equally human, all part of the same great story. The Roman Empire rose from nothing and returned to nothing, as all things do. But in between, it was magnificent, terrible, beautiful, cruel, inspiring, and cautionary. It was human, in all that word implies, and in being human, it speaks to something universal, something that transcends the particular time and place. That is why, 2,000 years after Augustus established the empire, we still tell Rome's story, still learn from its example, still feel connected to those ancient people who lived such different lives yet felt such similar emotions. Sleep well, kind listener, and know that you have been a wonderful companion on this journey through history. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the gentle whispers of the past, with visions of marble columns catching the Mediterranean sun, of legions marching to distant frontiers, of merchants in crowded forums, of families gathered around hearths, of all the human moments that filled the 1,000 years of Rome's story. Tomorrow is another day, with its own challenges and opportunities, its own dramas and quiet moments. But tonight belongs to history, to memory, to the peaceful contemplation of all that has been. Rest now, and let the story of Rome drift with you into sleep, a lullaby from the ancient world, a reminder that we are part of something larger than ourselves, links in a chain stretching from the distant past into an unknowable future. The Tiber flows on in the darkness, as it has for millennia, as it will for millennia more, indifferent and eternal, a reminder that some things endure while empires rise and fall. May you find similar constancy in your own life, similar peace in the flowing moments, similar contentment in the simple fact of existence. The Romans sought glory and immortality. In the end, they found mortality like everyone else. But they also found meaning in the attempt, in the building and creating and striving, and that meaning endures even when the specific achievements do not. So let us leave Rome to its ruins and its memories, to the tourists who will visit tomorrow and the scholars who will study it for centuries to come. Let us return from the past to the present, from the ancient world to our own time, carrying with us the lessons and stories we have gathered. History is not an escape from the present but a way to understand it, to see our own time in context, to recognize patterns and possibilities. And with that thought, with gratitude for your patient listening and kind attention, I bid you good night. May history be not a burden but a gift, not a weight but wings, lifting us above the immediate moment to see the broader pattern, the longer arc, the deeper connections that make us human. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and know that whether you are in a bustling city or a quiet countryside, in a familiar bed or a temporary resting place, you are part of the same human family that includes those ancient Romans, that will include people yet unborn, that spans all times and places. The story of Rome has been told. The empire has risen and fallen once more in our telling. The night is deep and quiet, perfect for rest, for letting go of consciousness, for surrendering to sleep's gentle embrace. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel the softness beneath you, the comfort surrounding you, the peace settling over you like a blanket. You are safe. You are at rest. History continues, but for now, you can step aside from its flow, can pause in this quiet moment outside of time, can simply be, without effort or striving. The Romans worked and fought and built and argued, but they also rested, also slept, also found moments of peace. Follow their example in this if nothing else. Good night, dear listener. Thank you for this time together, for walking with me through the centuries, for allowing Rome's story to unfold in your mind. May it bring you peace, wisdom, and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the fragility and resilience of all human endeavors. Sleep now, and let Rome's long dream become your own, a peaceful journey through time's gentle current, into the restful darkness where all stories eventually lead. The empire sleeps. The centuries sleep. And now, so do you. Good night, and farewell, until history calls us together once more.